laws that we need to know. Rambam, we're learning the laws. This was finishing off the book of purity with the laws of Mikveh, right? The ritualarium, that is the pool of water that has to be either from a spring or rainwater, but not drawn water, taking water and pour it in. Also, even drawn water can be through pipes. It's very complicated in what the law is. But let's go now. We're going to the third chapter of the three chapters of today, chapter 7. A mikveh is not disqualified neither by the change of the water's taste nor the change of its smell, only because of the color changes, right? So if it smells not so nice or sweet, right? That's not a change. Change is from appearance. Okay, any substance that may not be used to constitute a mikveh initially disqualifies one if it causes its color to change. So what is implied? What does it mean? So let's say wine, milk, blood, or other liquids that are classified as fruit juices do not disqualify a mikveh if three lugim that fall into it, because it was only said the three lugim of drawn water disqualify a mikveh. They do, however, disqualify it if they change the color of the water. So three lugim is, let's say, for example, three lugim is like, let's say 3 gallons, but we use that as a, right? So if you, for a mikveh to be kosher, it has to have 40 saw, which is the size, like the size of a phone booth of water, that amount, that amount doesn't have to be in that shape of the phone booth, right? Water is fluid. Is how much water is necessary. If it's less than that and you had drawn water, just three lugim, 3 gallons, if you will, we'll call it that for the moment. Less of it, 37, and you put 3 drawn waters in, it disqualifies it. But when it comes to the color of it, it's not disqualified by the amount, it's disqualified by the change of the color, right? So even when the mikveh contains 100 saw and a log of wine or fruit juice falls into it and changes its color, it's unacceptable, right? So you have 100, so like 1 to 100, it's nothing. But if for whatever reason it changed its color, right? I mean, have to be a very, if it was a very strong color, sometimes you have something, a concentrated color, right? Of a wine, and it changed its color, then it's unacceptable. Similarly, the mikveh contains 20 saw or less of acceptable water, and a saw of wine or fruit juice fell into it without changing its color, the water is acceptable. So even if it's 20 or less, I mean, it's even less than half of what it needs to be, which also has a calculation of the law. Right, the saw of wine of the fruit juice, however, is not counted as a measure of the mikveh. If another 20 saw of acceptable water was added to the original 20, it is acceptable mikveh. Now, of course, 20 is not acceptable mikveh. No, but let's say you only had 20. And now you put in, right, this fell into it, this wine, right? But it didn't change its color. Now you add another 20, right? So of acceptable water that's not drawn, then it's acceptable. Of course, you get, yeah. It's making the point though, because These are the substances that cause a mikveh to be considered acceptable and do not disqualify it. Otherwise, others that disqualify it and do not cause it to be considered acceptable, and others that neither cause it to be acceptable nor to disqualify it. So 3 categories, right? There are substances, again, let's repeat this, that are acceptable and don't disqualify, as we'll see what that means. Then there's other things, those disqualify the mikveh. We're talking about the mikveh, right? That don't cause it to be considered acceptable, that they disqualify. They only disqualify and are not considered acceptable. And then others that are neither cause acceptable or disqualifying. What does this mean? Okay. These are the substances that cause a mikveh to be considered acceptable and do not disqualify it. Snow. Snow is acceptable. Hail, sleet, ice, salt, and the flowing mud. A mud that's like flowing mud, meaning it's going to disintegrate and become like part of the water, right? What does it mean? What does that mean? So the mikveh contains 39, right? 39 is not a kosher mikveh. You need 40, right? And I saw one of these substances fall into it, the mikveh becomes acceptable, right? So in other words, let's say snow, right? Or salt, right? So it becomes a salty. Remember, taste doesn't change the mikveh. Only salt is going to be, is not going to change its color. So it makes it complete. It completes it and doesn't disqualify it. Even if one brought 40 saw of snow initially and placed it in the cavity and crushed it there, the mikveh is complete and acceptable. Interesting. One of the ways you can make a kosher mikveh is you bring ice and you put it into the mikveh and let it melt. You brought it in, implement. You're not allowed to bring, but because it was ice and not water. If you brought it as ice carried it, an implement, whatever, right? Because a vessel makes it drawn. Here, I have liquid in here. This is drawn water as a result. But if it was ice in here, it's not water. And then I put that ice into the mikveh and let it melt there. All 40, it's kosher. Right? That's one of the ways they make a kosher mikveh. Because sometimes it's hard to get rainwater in a way that is kosher. Okay, so these were the substances that make it kosher, make it complete, and don't disqualify it, right? Now, these are the substances, in number 4, that disqualify the mikveh and never cause it to be considered acceptable. We'll see the example, right? Drawn water, right? This is water that's drawn. Drawn means it had human interaction. Human, I held it. The fact that I held it or I took it from, I poured it, that means drawn, okay? For it to be a kosher mikveh, it has to be heavenly water, right? From the rains collected, or as we just mentioned with ice, right? Because it's not water, that's why. And because it's not drawn water, it's drawn ice. Drawn ice is okay. So, whether pure or impure, water that was used for pickling, water that we use for cooking, a mixture of water and grape dregs before they became vinegar, and beer. So what does it imply? So when a mikveh contains 40 saw, minus the weight of a dinner, and the weight of a dinner of one of these liquids falls into it. So a quart, let's say it's 40 minus a quart. So it's not kosher, right? And now one of these, let's say pickled water, filled in, right? For example, it doesn't complete it, right? It doesn't complete it. It's not kosher. If 3 lugim, one of these liquids falls into the mikveh, it disqualifies it. So if it was just a quart, for example, then it doesn't disqualify it, but doesn't make it good. But if it was 3 lugim, 3 gallons, let's say, right? In other words, you had 37, and now you put in 3 to make it 40, it actually disqualifies it. Okay? Got it? Number 5. By the way, just to let you know when we say Mishnayos, the last Kaddish, and we say Mishnayos, we say the Mishnah, Rabbi Chana, the Kasha, also Kaddish Baruch exactly said Lifigam, did a mitzvah Shenem, right? This is the chapter that we're learning now, and the Mishnah that chapter is the one that we do the last Kaddish in davening, which is Kaddish Rabbanan, right? It's based on this Mishnah. The Rambam is basing on this. These are substances that neither disqualify the mikveh nor are considered acceptable. In other words, this is like not adding or subtracting. The previous one subtracted. The one before that added. Ice adds, right? Pickled water subtracts. Now this doesn't add or subtract. What are they? Other liquids, fruit juices, fish brine, fish oil, and the mixture of water and grape dregs that became vinegar. More interesting. So what does it imply? If there was a mikveh that contained 39 saws, so it's not kosher yet, it needs 40, and a saw of these liquids fell into it, so it doesn't cause it to be acceptable, right? It's not acceptable. Nevertheless, the water the mikveh contains is acceptable as it was beforehand. For these liquids is acceptable as beforehand. For these liquids disqualify a mikveh only if they changed its color. So it's not adding, it doesn't make it acceptable, but it doesn't disqualify it. Only if color, but that's. Okay, we're gonna stop over here. All right, folks.